It was the kind of morning that felt borrowed from someone else's war. The fog over Suffolk had not yet lifted when the engines of more than 800 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses began their long, grinding climb toward altitude. The date was the 8th of April, 1944. The target was a Messerschmitt production complex outside Regensburg, deep inside the Reich. The planners at 8th Air Force Headquarters had assigned the mission a difficulty rating they rarely used. They called it extreme. That word on that morning was not an exaggeration. Among the 800 crews preparing to fly that day, one man sat alone in a canvas chair at the rear of a hardstand at Molesworth Aerodrome, sharpening a pencil with a penknife. He wasn't writing anything. He was thinking. His name was Robert Earl Cassidy, and he was 22 years old, a staff sergeant from Wheeling, West Virginia, who had spent most of his childhood watching barges move coal down the Ohio River and most of his adolescence learning what happened to boys who hesitated in the wrong part of town. He was the tail gunner aboard a B-17 his crew had named Pale Rider. He had flown 11 missions. He had survived things that by statistical measure he should not have survived. And on this particular morning, he had decided to change the way he did his job. What Cassidy attempted that day over southern Germany, and what resulted from it, did not make headlines. His name never appeared in Stars and Stripes. He received no ticker tape parade, no radio interview, no photograph on the cover of Life magazine. What he received instead was something more durable and more consequential. He received results. And the results he produced in 47 minutes of sustained aerial combat above the Bavarian Plateau would be studied, debated, adopted, and eventually codified into doctrine by military aviation planners on 3 continents.
This is the story of how a quiet man from West Virginia looked at a problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable, concluded they were wrong, and proved it at 30,000 feet with nothing but instinct, cold logic, and 2 50 caliber machine guns. Robert Cassidy did not seem like a revolutionary. People who knew him before the war described him in nearly identical terms: steady, careful, not the kind to draw attention. His high school principal in Wheeling remembered him as the student most likely to finish what he started, which was less a compliment than an observation. Cassidy was not especially fast, not especially loud, not the first name anyone called when excitement was required. What he was, without exception, was thorough. He had worked summers at a machine shop owned by his uncle, learning to read tolerances and respect the logic of mechanical systems. He understood that machines did not lie. A component either held its specification or it did not. A process either produced the intended result or it required correction. There was no sentiment in it, no room for wishful thinking. Either the math worked or it did not, and if it did not, you changed the math. When the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor pulled America into the war, Cassidy enlisted within the week. He requested the Army Air Forces, passed his physical, and was told he was well suited for ground maintenance. He declined. He wanted to fly. The recruiter explained, with the particular patience reserved for people who do not understand how things work, that Cassidy's aptitude scores were better matched to technical support roles. Cassidy listened politely, then asked again to be considered for aircrew. He was eventually assigned to aerial gunnery training at Tyndall Field in Florida, which was not what either of them had imagined but was close enough to count. He excelled at gunnery school, though not in the way the instructors expected. His accuracy scores were good, but not exceptional.
His physical reflexes were adequate. What set him apart was something harder to quantify and harder to teach: He asked questions that the instructors did not have ready answers for. Not disruptive questions, not defiant ones, precise ones. Questions like, if a fighter pilot sees tracers passing in front of his aircraft, what does he do? Questions like, what is the statistical relationship between the moment a German pilot commits to an attack run and the moment that commitment becomes irreversible? Questions like, has anyone actually measured whether suppressive fire at long range costs more or less ammunition per prevented attack than reactive fire at short range? The instructors mostly did not know. The curriculum did not cover those questions because the curriculum had been written around a doctrine of defensive response that nobody had seriously examined since the early months of the European air campaign. Cassidy wrote the answers down himself, as best he could figure them from first principles, in a small notebook he carried in his breast pocket. He filled 31 pages of that notebook before he ever climbed into a combat aircraft. His crew aboard Pale Rider accepted him the way crews accepted all their members, with cautious neutrality that softened into something warmer after the first 2 or 3 missions. The pilot, First Lieutenant Harold Ogren from Minneapolis, was methodical and calm, the kind of officer who read maintenance reports for pleasure and briefed his crew with the thoroughness of a man who believed preparation was a moral obligation. The navigator, Lieutenant Jerome Pinsky, had been a mathematics teacher before the war. The bombardier, Lieutenant Thomas Aguilar, had grown up in New Mexico and spoke with an unhurried cadence that suggested everything was going to be fine, a quality that proved enormously valuable at high altitude under fire. Cassidy's position at the tail was the most isolated on the aircraft, separated from the rest of the crew by the length of the fuselage and the constant roar of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines. In combat, the tail gunner saw what was coming from behind before anyone else did, which meant he also saw the worst of it before anyone else did. The German fighter pilots had long since learned that the most efficient approach vector against a B-17 was from the rear and slightly below, an angle that minimized the time a bomber's defensive guns could track them while maximizing their own firing time. The tail gunner was the primary obstacle to that approach. He was also, consequently, the primary target. The casualty statistics for tail gunners in the 8th Air Force during the winter and spring of 1944 were not circulated widely among air crews for the obvious reason that they were not helpful to morale. Cassidy had calculated them himself from the information available to him. He had access to the right numbers if he asked the right people in the right order, and he was patient enough to do that. What he found was that roughly 1 in 3 tail gunners did not complete their required 25 mission tour. Some were killed, some were wounded severely enough to be removed from flight status, some were lost with their aircraft. The surviving 2 in 3 lived in a state of controlled apprehension that the official records described as combat fatigue, and that the men themselves described in simpler terms. The doctrine that governed their work was built around the concept of the defensive arc. A tail gunner's job was to protect his aircraft from stern attack. He was to hold fire until enemy fighters entered a clearly defined engagement envelope, conserve his ammunition for sustained defensive action across a full mission, and avoid actions that would expose the aircraft to unnecessary risk. The doctrine was sensible, careful, and grounded in the experience of the early air campaign. It was also, Cassidy had concluded by his 9th mission, fundamentally wrong. The wrongness was not obvious. The doctrine worked in the narrow sense that bombers defended by it sometimes survived, but the logic underlying it contained an assumption so deep that nobody had thought to examine it. The assumption was this: In a contest between an attacking fighter and a defending bomber, the fighter controlled the terms of engagement. The fighter chose when to attack, from which angle, in what formation. The bomber's defensive guns reacted to the fighter's choices. The initiative, in the language of military theory, belonged to the attacker. Cassidy believed this was not a fixed condition. It was a choice the American doctrine had made, perhaps without fully realizing it, and a choice that could be unmade. He had spent the winter of 43 to 44 developing an alternative. Not a theoretical alternative, not an essay or a proposal. A practical system tested in the controlled circumstances available to him, refined through the accumulation of small observations that most people would not have thought to make. He watched how German fighters organized their attack formations. He noted the moment in that process when individual pilots committed to their approach vectors. He measured, as precisely as he could, the psychological disruption produced by unexpected fire at ranges most gunners would have considered wasteful. He was building, piece by piece, a new way of thinking about the problem. On the morning of the 8th of April, 1944, he intended to use it. Pale Rider crossed the Dutch coast at 0840 and climbed through broken cloud into the sharp, killing cold of high altitude. The crew went to oxygen. The temperature at 30,000 feet was minus 42 degrees Celsius, a figure that was not merely uncomfortable, but actively dangerous. Exposed skin froze in under a minute. Metal components became brittle. The lubricant in gun mechanisms thickened and failed if not properly maintained. Cassidy had modified his maintenance procedure for exactly this condition, heating the oil before loading, cycling the action repeatedly during the climb to keep it free. Small things, the kind of attention to detail that the maintenance notebook had trained him toward. The formation crossed Germany's western frontier at 0915. Cassidy called up Ogren on the interphone. He said, "I'm going to try something today. I need you to know about it before it happens," Ogren said. "Tell me." Cassidy told him. The conversation took approximately 90 seconds. Ogren listened without interruption. When Cassidy finished, the pilot was quiet for a moment, then said, "How confident are you?" Cassidy said, "Enough to ask permission." Ogren thought about it. Then he said, "You have it. But if we take catastrophic damage from a fighter that got through while you were doing something else, I want you to have thought about that beforehand." Cassidy said he had thought about it. He had thought about very little else for 3 months. The first German fighters appeared at 0951. The radio operator, Sergeant Franklin Delacroix, called them out. "Bandits, 6 o'clock high, 9 aircraft, forming up at 1,800 yards. Standard approach, standard formation. The precise configuration Cassidy had been watching for 11 missions and mentally rehearsing for the past 12 weeks. Most tail gunners at that moment would have done one of two things. The more experienced would have tracked the lead fighter, waited for it to enter effective range, and opened fire at around 700 yards. The less experienced would have opened fire too early, wasted ammunition, and created a tracking problem when the attack came in earnest. Both approaches accepted the same premise. The fight began when the Germans chose to begin it. Cassidy opened fire at 1,800 yards. Not at the lead fighter, not at the wingmen. He aimed at the geometric center of the formation, the point in space around which the attack coordination was organized. He fired a long, deliberate burst of approximately 40 rounds, walked the tracers slowly through the formation's core, and watched what happened. What happened was this. nothing that the German pilots had trained for. The lead fighter broke right, a sharp defensive turn that was pure reflex, hardwired by training and experience. The left wingman pulled up, the right wingman nosed down. The formation, which had been organizing itself with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times, came apart in approximately 4 seconds. 9 aircraft became 9 individuals, each responding to the unexpected stimulus of incoming fire from a range at which incoming fire was not supposed to exist. Ogren's voice on the interphone. "What just happened?" Cassidy said. "Give me a minute." The German pilots were professional. They regrouped faster than he had expected, approximately 90 seconds to reestablish formation discipline. But the approach vector had changed. They were no longer coming in from 6 o'clock high, the most efficient angle. They had shifted to 6 o'clock level, slightly less efficient, slightly more defensive. The disruption had cost them something real. Cassidy let them close to 1,400 yards before he fired again. This time, he did not aim at the formation center. He aimed at the lead fighter specifically, walked his rounds into the aircraft's nose section with a careful economic burst of 22 rounds. The fighter did not explode. It trailed smoke, broke off, and descended. One less aircraft. More importantly, the pilots behind the lead had watched their experienced colleague take precise fire at a range they had been taught was outside the threat envelope. The psychological math of the situation had changed. 6 remaining fighters pressed the attack. 2 broke off when Cassidy put suppressive bursts across their noses at 1,100 yards. 4 continued. Of those 4, Cassidy killed 2 in the next 30 seconds. The first with a 30-round burst that caught the engine, the second with a shorter burst that the pilot flew directly into while attempting an evasive maneuver. The other 2 reached firing range, put cannon rounds into Pale Rider's horizontal stabilizer and the number 3 engine nacelle, and broke off. The number 3 engine began throwing oil but kept running. The stabilizer damage was cosmetic. The aircraft flew on. Cassidy took stock. He had fired 260 rounds in approximately 4 minutes. He had killed 3 fighters, damaged 1, and turned back 2. In the same engagement, a defensive doctrine gunner would likely have fired between 80 and 120 rounds, killed possibly 1 fighter, and endured a more complete attack run from the others. The ammunition expenditure was higher. The damage sustained was lower. The math, as Cassidy had calculated it in his notebook, worked. But the morning had not finished with him. 40 minutes later, as the formation approached the initial point for the bomb run, the fighter controller frequency carried a new warning. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Anthony Morales, who had a view of the sky below the aircraft that Cassidy lacked, called it over the interphone with the particular flatness of voice that experienced aircrew used when the situation was genuinely serious. He counted 28 aircraft forming up below and behind the formation. A full group, multiple types, BF-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s mixed, coming up fast from 7,000 feet below, climbing to attack altitude, still organizing. 28 fighters against a single B-17's defensive guns was not a fight. It was a mathematical certainty expressed in metal and fire. The escort fighters, P-51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group, were 15 miles ahead of the formation, drawn off by a diversionary attack that the German ground controller had coordinated precisely for this purpose. Pale Rider and 2 other bombers that had drifted slightly from formation were exposed, unsupported, and watched by 28 pilots who had been briefed on exactly this kind of opportunity. Cassidy had 260 rounds remaining in his tail position. He had approximately 90 seconds before the German formation completed its climb and organized itself for attack. He did not spend those 90 seconds in reflection. He spent them calculating. The German fighters were climbing from below, which meant their forward speed was reduced by the energy demands of the climb. They were still forming up, which meant coordination was incomplete. Their attack doctrine called for the lead element to establish itself at 6 o'clock before the supporting elements moved into flanking positions. That establishment process had a specific duration, and during that duration, the formation's geometric center was predictable. Cassidy called Ogren. He said, "I need you to know that I am going to fire everything I have left in the next 2 minutes." Ogren said, "Say again?" Cassidy said, "If I spread the ammunition across the full engagement, we take the full attack. If I concentrate everything now, while they are still climbing and organizing, I may be able to break their coordination before it sets. After that, I am empty. Whatever happens after that happens without me." There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds, which in the circumstances was a long time to be quiet. Ogren said, "Do it." The German formation was at 1,200 yards and climbing when Cassidy opened fire. He did not aim at individual aircraft. He aimed at the center of mass of the entire formation, the point around which the attack coordination was crystallizing, and he fired in sustained bursts that walked methodically from left to right across the face of the climbing group. He was not trying to kill every pilot. He was trying to introduce chaos into a system that required order to function. The effect was violent and immediate. 3 aircraft in the center of the formation took direct hits in the first 10 seconds. 1 exploded. 2 fell away trailing fire. The pilots around them reacted to the sudden violence with the combination of training and instinct that fighter pilots use when their situation analysis breaks down. They maneuvered defensively, each man making his own decision, each decision different from the others, the formation losing its coherence in real time. 20 seconds after Cassidy opened fire, the formation had ceased to exist as a coordinated tactical unit. What remained were 25 individual aircraft in varying states of awareness scattered across a volume of sky perhaps 3 miles across, each pilot trying to reorient himself. The attack had not been executed. It had been interrupted at the moment of its maximum vulnerability. Cassidy fired his last rounds 18 seconds later. He had killed 3 aircraft and damaged 2 more. He had expended his entire remaining ammunition load, 260 rounds, in less than 40 seconds. His guns were empty. The mission had more than an hour remaining. What happened next is the part of the story that the post-war analysts found most instructive. The German pilots regrouped. It took them longer than usual, approximately 4 minutes, partly because of the losses and the disruption, and partly because the aggressive, unexpected nature of the fire had introduced a level of caution that coordinated attacks do not accommodate well. When they came back, they came from 6 o'clock in a tighter formation, slower, more careful, very different from the aggressive climbing swarm of 4 minutes earlier. Cassidy traversed his empty guns to track the lead fighter. He maintained perfect tracking discipline. He elevated his barrels at the correct rate. He held his aim point with the practiced precision of a man whose guns were fully loaded and ready to fire. The lead pilot saw the guns tracking him. He saw the barrels aligned precisely with his cockpit. He broke left. It was not a decision. It was a reflex, as automatic and involuntary as a flinch. And because the lead pilot broke left, The pilots behind him broke left too, following the leader the way formation pilots are trained to do, and the attack dissolved for the second time in 4 minutes. Cassidy had no ammunition. He had not fired a single round. He had broken a 25 aircraft attack with gesture alone. With the reputation that his previous 4 minutes had built into those pilots, into their nervous systems, into the part of the human brain that calculates danger before the conscious mind finishes the question. Ogren's voice on the interphone was very quiet. He said, "Are you all right back there?" Cassidy said, "I am fine. I am out of ammunition, but I am fine." Ogren said, "I know you are out of ammunition." Pale Rider completed its bomb run, hit the target, and turned for England. The German fighters shadowed the formation for the next 20 minutes, but did not attack. Not Pale Rider, not the 2 other bombers that had drifted with it. At one point, a German radio broadcast intercepted by the formation's radio operator contained a phrase that the signals intelligence section translated later that afternoon. It said, "Avoid the straggler with the aggressive tail. Too expensive. Too expensive." 2 words. The most accurate assessment anyone made that day of what Robert Earl Cassidy had accomplished. He landed at Molesworth at 15:22. The ground crew found 41 bullet holes in the aircraft, 2 cannon strikes on the horizontal stabilizer, and an oil leak in the number 3 engine that had somehow failed to cause a fire. They found Cassidy sitting on the tarmac with his back against the main gear, eating a sandwich, apparently in no particular distress. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Donald Birch, walked over and looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "The guns are empty, both of them." Cassidy said, "I know." Birch said, "You fired every round we loaded." Cassidy said, "I needed all of them." Birch said, "You also killed 5 fighters and turned back what I am counting from the debriefing reports as somewhere between 20 and 30 others." Cassidy said, 23 turned back in the second engagement, 3 killed outright, 2 with significant damage. 2 turned back by empty guns." Birch looked at him. He said, "You counted." Cassidy said, "I always count. That is how you know if it is working." The intelligence officers who debriefed him that afternoon used a word in their report that they did not often use. The word was systematic. Most combat accounts described improvisation, instinct, desperation, luck. Cassidy's account described a methodology. He had a theory. He had tested it. He had results. He knew which elements of his approach had produced which outcomes and which needed refinement. He had already identified 2 adjustments he intended to make on his next mission. The report moved up the chain of command faster than most debriefing documents did. By the following morning, it was on the desk of Colonel Walter Brannigan, who commanded the 303rd Bombardment Group and who had been quietly accumulating reports of unusual gunner performance for the past several months. He had noticed a pattern. The bombers with the lowest damage rates were not necessarily the ones with the most experienced gunners. They were the ones with the most aggressive gunners. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was consistent enough to be interesting, and Brannigan was the kind of officer who found interesting things interesting rather than inconvenient. He requested a meeting with Cassidy the following day. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Brannigan asked questions. Cassidy answered them with a precision that the colonel later described to his operations officer as almost uncomfortable, the kind of clarity you associate with someone who has spent a long time alone with a problem. Cassidy explained his theory of initiative, his analysis of the German approach doctrine, his hypothesis about the psychological dynamics of formation cohesion under unexpected fire. He drew diagrams on a legal pad. He referenced specific engagements with specific ammunition counts and specific outcomes. He knew what had worked and what had not, and why. Brannigan said, "You understand that what you are describing is a significant departure from established doctrine." Cassidy said, "Yes, sir. The established doctrine has a 40% casualty rate for tail gunners. I don't think that rate is acceptable if there is an alternative." Brannigan said, 41% currently. "And what is your proposed alternative?" Cassidy said, "Teach tail gunners that they are not defending an aircraft. They are fighting a battle." The distinction sounds semantic, but it is not. A man defending an aircraft waits for the threat to materialize and responds to it. A man fighting a battle looks for the moment when the enemy is most vulnerable and acts before that moment passes. Those two men will behave very differently under identical conditions. Brannigan studied him for a moment. Then he said, "How many gunners do you think you can teach this to?" Cassidy said, "Not all of them. Some men are built for it and some are not. The ones who are built for it are not necessarily the best shots or the most experienced. They are the ones who find waiting harder than acting." Brannigan picked up a pen. He said, "I'm going to send your name to 8th Air Force Bomber Command with a recommendation. I want you to understand that if they accept it, you will likely be reassigned from combat duty to an instructional role." Cassidy said, "Sir, I have 14 missions remaining in my tour. I would prefer to finish." Brannigan said, "I thought you might say that. Finish your tour. Document everything. When you are done, we will talk about what comes next." Cassidy flew his remaining 14 missions. He had to wait to fly one of them for 11 days when Pale Rider went into maintenance for an engine replacement. He used the time to write. He produced 47 pages of observations, analysis, and procedural recommendations that he titled, with characteristic plainness, "Notes on Aggressive Tail Gunnery." He had no particular illusions about the document's literary quality. He was trying to be clear, not eloquent. Clarity, in his estimation, was more useful. He finished his tour on the 14th of June, 1944, 8 days after the Allied landings in Normandy. In 25 missions, he had claimed 8 confirmed kills, 3 probables, and 7 aircraft damaged. The tail position of Pale Rider had been hit by fire on 4 occasions. Cassidy had been wounded once, a fragment from a 20mm cannon round that opened a 2-inch gash on his left forearm and was treated at the field hospital and not mentioned in his mission report because he did not think it was relevant. What he thought was relevant was the data. He had spent 25 missions collecting it, and he had brought it with him when he reported to Brannigan's office the morning after his last flight. The transfer to 8th Air Force Training Command came through in late June. Cassidy was promoted to technical sergeant and assigned to Bassingbourn, where a new program had been authorized to develop and deliver advanced gunnery training for tail gunners across the 8th Air Force. He was given a small office, an assistant, access to the airfield, and the authority to requisition aircraft for live fire exercises. He was also given a mandate that Brannigan had written in 2 sentences on the authorization form. Teach what works, not what was taught before. Forget the doctrine if the data says to forget it. Cassidy spent 3 days reading everything the training command had previously produced on aerial gunnery. Then he set it aside and started from the beginning. The curriculum he developed over the following 6 weeks was unlike anything the training command had previously offered. It began not with gunnery mechanics, but with decision theory. Cassidy wanted his students to understand, before they touched a weapon, why the choice between action and reaction was not merely tactical, but psychological, and why the human tendency toward defensive posture in threatening situations, while evolutionarily sensible, was tactically counterproductive in the tail gun position. He brought in a psychologist from the flight surgeon's office, a Major Evelyn Hartwell, who had been studying combat stress responses in aircrews. Hartwell was initially skeptical that a gunnery training program needed a psychologist's input. Cassidy explained his reasoning with the patience he brought to everything. The reason defensive doctrine persisted despite its failure rate was not that gunners were unintelligent, but that it matched the natural human response to threat. Teaching an alternative required understanding the psychology of the default response and offering a framework that the mind could adopt under the conditions of combat stress, when there was no time for deliberation and only trained reflexes were available. Hartwell found this argument sufficiently interesting to attend 3 sessions of the training program as an observer. By the end of the 3rd session, she had restructured her observations into a formal report that she submitted to the Flight Surgeon General's office. The report was titled, "Cognitive Reframing in Aerial Gunnery Training." It became one of the foundational documents of what would later be called combat stress management in military aviation. Cassidy didn't know this until 1968, when someone sent him a copy with a note saying he was cited in the footnotes. He trained his first class of 26 tail gunners in August of '44. The curriculum ran for 3 weeks. The first week was classroom instruction, German fighter tactics, attack formation analysis, decision theory, psychological preparation. The second week was live fire exercises, including a simulation that Cassidy had designed specifically to train early engagement at extreme range. He had rigged a target sleeve system that required gunners to begin firing at ranges most gunnery school instructors would have called irresponsible. The purpose was not accuracy at those ranges. The purpose was overcoming the trained hesitation that most gunners brought to long-range engagement. The third week was integration exercises, practice under conditions as close to actual combat as the training command could arrange without flying into Germany. Of the 26 men in the first class, 19 completed the full program and received the designation that Cassidy invented for the purpose: Advanced Gunnery, Aggressive Doctrine. Of the 7 who did not complete, 4 were transferred back to standard training and eventually served with distinction in other roles. The other 3 Cassidy recommended for reassignment to non-flying positions, not as a criticism of their abilities, but because the aggressive doctrine genuinely was not suited to every temperament, and he preferred honesty on that point to the alternative. By October 1944, 412 graduates of Cassidy's program were assigned to tail gun positions across the 8th Air Force. The 8th Air Force Statistical Section tracked their performance as a cohort and compared it with the performance of tail gunners trained under the previous doctrine. The results were measurable, consistent, and significant. In the period from October through December 1944, graduates of the Cassidy program recorded 43% more confirmed kills per mission than non-graduates in comparable aircraft and comparable mission profiles. The statistic that mattered more to Cassidy, and that he checked first each time the monthly report arrived, was the casualty rate. In the same period, the casualty rate among Cassidy program graduates was 31% lower than the historical average for tail gunners and 24% lower than the concurrent rate among non-graduates. There were multiple ways to read those numbers. The most compelling reading, and the one the statistical section endorsed, was this: aggressive engagement reduced casualties not primarily by killing more fighters, but by disrupting the coordination of attacks before they could be fully executed. A fighter pilot pressing a well-organized attack was far more dangerous than a fighter pilot reacting to unexpected fire from a range at which he had not expected to encounter resistance. The difference between those two conditions was the difference between a gunner who waited and a gunner who acted.
The 8th Air Force presented the results to Bomber Command in December 1944. Brigadier General Harold Moore, who had been skeptical of the program when it was first proposed, reviewed the data personally. He called Cassidy to his office. Moore said, "Your numbers are holding up." Cassidy said, "Yes, sir." Moore said, "The Doctrine Committee wants to formalize this. Incorporate the aggressive engagement principles into the standard gunnery curriculum." Cassidy said, "That is appropriate, sir, with one condition." Moore looked at him. He said, "You are a technical sergeant, telling a brigadier general you have a condition." Cassidy said, "Yes, sir. The condition is that the curriculum retain its psychological component. The mechanics of aggressive fire are not complicated. Teaching men to choose action over reaction under combat stress is the hard part. If the committee removes the psychology, they will produce gunners who know the theory, but cannot implement it when it matters." Moore looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "The condition is noted." The formalized doctrine, published in January 1945 as 8th Air Force Gunnery Technical Order 45-1, retained the psychological component. It also cited Cassidy's original 47-page document, Notes on Aggressive Tail Gunnery, as a source reference. Cassidy did not know about the citation until a friend sent him a copy of the technical order in the spring of '45. He read it once, put it in a drawer, and went back to work. By the end of the war in Europe, more than 2,000 tail gunners had received training derived from Cassidy's program. The doctrine had spread beyond the 8th Air Force to the 15th Air Force in Italy and to the 20th Air Force in the Pacific. Adaptation to different aircraft types and different threat environments had produced variations that Cassidy himself had not anticipated, which was, in his estimation, how it was supposed to work.
He had not intended to write a fixed doctrine. He had intended to teach a way of thinking. The captured German records provided a perspective that the American analyses could not. Luftwaffe after-action reports from the late months of 1944 contained a recurring observation. American tail gunners were engaging at ranges that German fighter pilots had been trained to regard as safe. The reports noted that this unexpected early fire was producing a disproportionate psychological effect on attack formation cohesion, particularly among less experienced pilots. The recommended countermeasure was to approach from angles that limited tail gunner engagement windows, high-angle overhead attacks from 11 o'clock or 1 o'clock rather than direct stern approaches. This adaptation required different training and different aircraft handling, and implementing it under the conditions of the late air campaign, when the Luftwaffe was short of experienced instructors, short of fuel, and short of time, proved difficult. Many units attempted it. Few implemented it consistently. Those that did encountered a second complication. The Cassidy doctrine had spread to the waist gun positions as well, and the gunners there had applied the same aggressive early engagement principles to their sectors. The flanking approaches that were supposed to circumvent aggressive tail gunnery ran into aggressive waist gunnery instead. The post-war analysis was clear on the numbers. From January 1944 to the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, the 8th Air Force lost bomber aircraft at a progressively decreasing rate. Multiple factors contributed to this trend, including the introduction of long-range fighter escort and strategic targeting decisions that degraded Luftwaffe operational capacity. The internal analysis attributed between 22 and 30% of the improvement in bomber survival rates specifically to changes in defensive gunnery doctrine, with aggressive engagement principles identified as the primary driver of that change. Cassidy was released from military service in August 1945. He returned to Wheeling, West Virginia. He went back to work at his uncle's machine shop, which had grown considerably during the war years, producing precision components for defense contractors. Cassidy eventually managed the shop, then bought it from his uncle when the old man retired in 1953. He ran it until 1979, when he sold it to a regional manufacturing company and retired with a reasonable amount of money and a complete absence of celebrity. He gave one interview in 1961 to a journalist from an aviation magazine who had tracked down the connection between Cassidy and Gunnery Technical Order 45-1. The interview was published in a modest trade journal and read by approximately 4,000 people. In it, Cassidy said the one thing about the war that he returned to in every conversation that touched on the subject: the problem was not the fighters. The problem was the assumption. We had assumed that defense meant reacting. I just tried to find out what would happen if it meant acting first. Turned out it meant a lot. He died in 2002 at the age of 80. The Wheeling Intelligencer ran 4 paragraphs. His family requested no military ceremony in accordance with his wishes. His crew from Pale Rider, 4 of whom were still living, gathered in a restaurant in Minneapolis that Harold Ogren had frequented for 40 years and told the stories they had been telling each other for decades. At some point in the evening, Ogren, who was the last surviving officer of the crew and who had rarely spoken publicly about the war, said the thing that the others had been thinking. He said, "The thing about Cassidy was that he never thought of himself as doing anything special. He thought he was just solving a problem. The rest of us knew he was doing something different. He was the only one in that aircraft who looked at a situation that everyone else accepted as fixed and decided it was not fixed. He decided it was a variable, and that if it was a variable, you could change it. You can teach tactics. You cannot teach that way of seeing." The doctrine that Cassidy developed out of 47 pages written in a billet at Molesworth in the spring of 1944 is not called the Cassidy Doctrine. It was never named after him. It is called, in the manuals and technical orders that carried it forward through the post-war decades, simply Aggressive Engagement Doctrine, a phrase so compact and unremarkable that it does not suggest the specific intelligence and specific courage from which it emerged. But the logic is his, and the logic is still taught. It appears in modern aircrew training materials, in naval aviation defensive doctrine, in the analytical frameworks that defense theorists use when they discuss the relationship between initiative and survival under fire. It has been applied to contexts that Cassidy could not have imagined from a tail gun position at 30,000 feet over Germany in 1944. Ground-based air defense systems that engage threats during their approach phase rather than their attack phase. Cybersecurity protocols that prioritize early disruption of coordinated attacks over reactive containment. Game theory applications in conflict modeling that formalize exactly the insight Cassidy reached by observation. In a contest between coordinated attack and reactive defense, the attacker holds the initiative, and the only way to take that initiative back is to act before the attack is ready. He was not a theorist. He was a machinist's nephew from West Virginia who liked to know whether things were working correctly and was willing to change them if they were not. He sat in a cold metal tube at 30,000 feet with 2 machine guns and a notebook full of observations, and he concluded that the way things had always done was not the only way they could be done. And then he proved it. Some problems look like they have fixed solutions until someone decides they are variables. The history of warfare, and perhaps the history of most things that matter, turns on the people who make that decision and have the patience and the nerve to test what they find. Robert Earl Cassidy was one of those people. He just never said so himself. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing. These histories deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us tell them. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We keep these stories alive by telling them.